in not only we have the statements about the disciples being, attacked, beaten, threatened, told, Acts chapter 3, they're like, don't be preaching this Jesus stuff anymore. When Paul goes out, they stone him. He goes back in to the same city again. These are the stories. Now, you may think they're overblown, but they have a historical core. Even if you don't think the Bible's trustworthy, there's some historical core this is coming from. Luke's not just fabricating stories. The mythicist, I know you're not a mythicist, but the mythicist side of things is just honestly very naive about the history we're looking at.
Right. But I guess where my case hinges upon is that I totally grant that early Christians probably suffered a lot of, persecution. But we just don't really know that there's no specific evidence that the people who were able to discern whether this was truth or not, we don't have evidence that they are the ones who are being persecuted.
Okay, so let me read to you if I can. This is from Clement of Rome, okay? Because this is something that we're kind of going back and forth on. Clement of Rome, this is in like 97 AD, and he writes this about Peter and Paul. He says, because of envy and jealousy, the greatest and most righteous pillars have been persecuted and contended unto death. Let us set the good apostles before our eyes. Peter, who because of unrighteous envy endured not one or two, but many afflictions, and having borne witness, went to the due glorious place. Because of envy and rivalries, steadfast Paul pointed to the prize. 7 times chained, exiled, stoned, having become a preacher both in the East and in the West, he received honor fitting for his faith, having taught the righteousness to the whole world, unto the boundary unto which the sun sets, having testified in the presence of the leaders. Thus he was freed from the world and went to the holy place. He became a great example of steadfastness. We read about Paul's imprisonment in Rome. We read about Jewish assassins, vowing to not eat unless they kill Paul. We read about the specific threats from the opponents. We have the example of Jesus who was crucified because of his claims. Everything that we read about is 100% consistent. Do you have even one source that suggests that any of this is not true?
I'm actually going to fully grant you Peter and Paul. Like that's, I guess, where that was my question was, do we know about anyone other than Peter and Paul? Do we have good evidence that they even went along with this, that they were even telling people that Jesus was alive? Like you're using that as a point that the 12 disciples died for this and believed it to the point of being suffered. And I'm saying, other than Peter and Paul, we don't really have any good sources to say that any of those people, suffered.
So, okay, in Tacitus, we read about how Nero took Christians and put them on crosses and set them on fire and used them as torches. Tacitus was not a Christian, by the way. He's not writing something to make Christian martyrs look good.
But those people...
He actually mocks Christians.
Right, but those Christians were the second generation Christians, right? Those were...
Nero was Caesar when Paul was killed.
Understood, but we don't know that. Again, you want to say that Jesus appeared to the 12. That's what we were originally started with. So appeared to Cephas, then to the 12. And I'm saying, of those 12, who are the only people we can verify, like nothing that Nero did is necessarily happened to Bartholomew, necessarily happened to Matthew, necessarily happened to, to John, and James. Like,
can I interject real quick just to let you guys know? We're coming up on the 90-minute mark. So we're probably going to roll for about 10 more minutes, just to kind of let you guys know, so you can steer the conversation.
Well, how about we move on to a different topic, Paul? You can pick what you want to talk about. What?
All right, I'd love to talk about the empty tomb, only because, not only because, Gary Habermas I wrote it down for myself, at the CES conference in 2017. Stopped using the empty tomb. Gary stopped using the empty tomb as one of his basic facts because he no longer considered it to be adequately attested as a fact. Was that something you're aware of? Did you build that into your thing?
He doesn't. Well, I'm not. I mean, and when I say I'm presenting the empty tomb, I'm doing that on my own. Habermas doesn't present it because his minimal facts case is this is what's a consensus view, and the empty tomb is not consensus. However, it is a majority view. And I think that we should still at least consider something if it's a majority view, even in a hotly debated issue where the empty tomb becomes something where it's like, dude, that's solid evidence for Jesus. You can expect that people have worldview issues on the topic. So it's nice that there's even a majority.
The empty tomb is only majority when you look at New Testament scholars, not historical scholars, and that's why Gary had to remove it. It's
Do you have a source for that?
Just Gary at his speech.
I don't think he says that. I mean, I'd like to hear it and read it. I don't think he says that.
Okay.
I think that's a mistake.
I mean, and again, he's the only one who's done this, supposed thing. I would back it up with the Bart Ehrman, William Lane Craig debate. Bart actually laid out again what historians do versus New Testament scholars. So I'd point you to that debate as well. Bart also refutes, and no surprise probably to you, Bart doesn't accept the empty tomb. But you talked about the empty tomb in terms of the principle of embarrassment. Again, it's well known that women at the time, were the ones who looked after the body. So it makes total sense that Mark would have, not only would Mark have done that because that was the custom at the time, it would have been weird if the apostles lowered themselves and were the first ones for the tomb. But also Mark's whole gospel, and you've probably heard me say this before, Mark's whole gospel is actually to say that the outsiders were the ones who recognized who Jesus was, and the disciples were the ones that didn't. So I don't find the chronicle or the principle of embarrassment to be particularly compelling in general. It doesn't seem to be used by historians outside of the New Testament scholarship.
Okay, so two claims there that are really big. You made two really big claims there. One is about the nature of Mark, and the other one is about the criterion of embarrassment or dissimilarity. I looked this up because in one of your videos you said, let's talk about the criterion itself. You said that only theologians use the criterion of embarrassment. But then I found a lecture from Bart Ehrman, of all people, talking about all the historical criteria, and he included in it the criterion of embarrassment or dissimilarity. And I encourage people to go and look it up on your own. Yes, this is legitimate. Basically, it goes like this. It's not as...
I'll actually grant you that. If I said theologians, I misspoke, but it seems to be only people in the New Testament studies, and it doesn't seem to apply to any other. And I'd love to see examples where the criterion of embarrassment applies outside of New Testament studies. It doesn't seem to be a thing.
So it's the criterion. It's this dissimilarity is the concept, and the idea is this: is that when we look at the purpose the author has for writing, and we say this is a fact that they're admitting because it's just true, they can't get around it, it's just true, they're not doing it because of their interests, then that makes it more likely to be true. And you said this in the same video, which I thought was really strange, is you said that only theologians use this. You then said, I believe the disciples really fled at the crucifixion of Christ. They really ran and hid. And he says, because it was just so well known, they couldn't hide it, so they included it in the story, which is you using the criterion in the same video where you're saying it doesn't exist.
I have to wrap my head around your logic there. No, I just believe it from human nature, I guess, but you're... Okay. But do you think the criterion of embarrassment applies outside of New Testament studies? Like, are you familiar? This seems to be something that
I think it's good for evaluating testimony of any kind.
There's lots of reasons why. Okay. Sorry, I spoke over you and I didn't quite.
Yeah. The second thing you said was about the Gospel of Mark, and you said that in Mark, the theme in Mark is the disciples don't get it, but outsiders do, and that's just not true. Like, he gives them the parables and then he explains it to only them. They're the ones that do get it. It's Peter that is the one who kind of has the inside knowledge on who Jesus is. This is something I've heard that it's like the women find the tomb to be some sort of poetic theme in Mark. Like, if you really study Mark, that's just ad hoc. That's just thrown out there. I know that you didn't come up with that, but the guys that you study Mark, that's not the case.
Well, there's a centurion, right?
Yeah.
Does the centurion
ad hoc
the one
means
who says,
non-evidenced assumption. Yeah.
That's a non-evidenced assumption? You don't mean after the fact by ad hoc?
I mean a non-evidenced assumption. I just made it for this. Okay. This is the yeah.
Well, that's what people who study the Book of Mark, they agree that is a theme. Like, and maybe not all the scholars agree, but certainly lots of people look at the Book of Mark. Christians look at the Book of Mark, and
that there's a theme that women. And the theme has to be used in a specific way here. The theme is that women will be the witnesses of Jesus, whereas the disciples themselves, who are the ones to be the witnesses of the resurrection, they won't, for some reason, be the ones to discover the tomb. Well, it just seems like this is made up to avoid the idea that it's embarrassing.
Well, but if that wasn't the case, Mark doesn't even...
Wait.
All right.
Paul, we have 3 minutes, so go ahead and start wrapping this up, and then we'll be asking questions from people that have messaged us some questions that we'll be asking. So.
Okay.
All right, I'll just close that. So if indeed what you said was true, I would think that Mark would include the disciples actually finding out about it. But Mark ends without the disciples ever finding out. The centurion knows what's happening, the women know what's happening, and the women from before are the ones who recognize who Jesus is and all that stuff happening.
Okay, this will be the last thing I'd say before questions, I guess. I want to respond to the ending of Mark. At the end of Mark, if you just read more than the very last verse of what we're considering to be the authentic Mark, right? So he says, do not be alarmed. The messenger says to them, you seek Jesus of Nazareth, who is crucified. He's risen. He's not here. See the place where they laid him. But go tell his disciples and Peter that he is going before you to Galilee. There you will see him just as he told you. And then it says, and they went out and fled from the tomb, for trembling and astonishment had seized them. And they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. That phrase, said nothing to anyone, is used another time in Mark, and it's in Mark 1:44. And that is used when Jesus heals a leper, and he tells him, go to the priests and show yourself to the priests, but on your way there, say nothing to anyone. The idea is that the women, on their way to see the disciples and tell Peter and the disciples, they said nothing to anyone. It was an incredibly dangerous time for those women to open their mouths and say, Jesus is alive again. They were to go straight to the disciples and just tell them. That's the context of Mark.
But of course, in the other disciples, their gospels, they do immediately the opposite of that. They go and run and tell Peter. Anyway, so I would just love to end with. So, from my perspective, a miracle happening is the least probable thing that a historian could come up with. So again, it's not impossible. There's certainly you could prove that a miracle happened, but you would need a lot of evidence. What we have so far is we have evidence of one person who admits that he saw visions, and all we need is one other person to think that they saw Jesus, and you have a very mundane claim that people were either mistaken or lying. Two people were mistaken or lying adequately explains everything that we've discussed, all the facts that we've discussed, the three very basic facts. So I don't see that we've seen anything tonight that requires a supernatural event to explain the facts. Even if a supernatural event explains it very well, there's nothing that requires it. So from my perspective, certainly a resurrection, we don't have enough evidence to say the resurrection happened. And that's my end statement, I guess.
I believe you were invoking Kyle's razor there, Paul.
Mm-hmm.
The least exciting of two proposed explanations is always the truest.
The least exciting. Could I have a 1 minute wrap up since Paul got one of those?
Yes, I was getting ready to go to you next.
Oh, I appreciate that. Mm-hmm. Okay, so my case was to present these sort of three widely accepted facts. I added a fourth that is a majority, believed in fact that just kind of adds a lot more support even to my case, and that the most reasonable explanation is the resurrection of Jesus. Paul kind of went back and forth a little bit. I'm not sure how much of the facts he agrees with or doesn't agree with, but he seems to think the conclusion is likely if it's possible. Okay, yeah, the miracle really explains the evidence, but miracles are impossible. So that's a whole different issue we didn't really discuss. My point here is to say, unless you assume that it's impossible, it is actually the best explanation. Unless you give it such a low probability that no evidence would matter, and you have like a kind of vague definition of extraordinary evidence, unless you do that, then you have the evidence for the resurrection of Jesus as that's the most reasonable explanation. That means that unless I have a priori, my worldview tells me Jesus didn't rise from the dead, then I have a really good historical case for the resurrection of Jesus. And if I have an a priori worldview that says that Jesus didn't raise, then the truth is I don't care what the historical evidence is. I'm just going to try to work my way around it because I've already decided that doesn't happen, it didn't happen, it can't happen. So,
okay.
Thank you.
That was fantastic, guys. Love that. So we're gonna switch over
thank you,
to
Paul.